Hello, everybody. Welcome to the colloquium entitled Implicit Language Aptitude, Conceptualizing the Construct, Validating the Measures, and Examining the Evidence. My name is Shaofeng Li. I'm the organizer of this colloquium. I'm from Florida State University. I hope everybody is doing well wherever you are in this special time. So the talks of this colloquium examine the validity of implicit language aptitude, which I define as a cluster of cognitive abilities that enable learners to conduct unconscious computation of the distributional and transitional relationships of existing linguistic stimuli. For the purpose of this colloquium, I've prepared a few slides to introduce the speakers and the talks. So I'm going to walk you through the PowerPoint slides. All right, so implicit language aptitude, which is the theme of this colloquium, is a new construct in SLA, given that aptitude research has been dominated by explicit aptitude, which refers to the abilities for conscious second language learning. The papers included in this colloquium will be published in this year's special issue of Studies in Second Language Acquisition. The papers examine the validity of the construct of implicit language aptitude from three perspectives: convergent validity, divergent validity, and predictive validity. Convergent validity refers to whether measures of implicit aptitude are correlated. And divergent validity refers to whether implicit aptitude is distinct from or uncorrelated with measures of other constructs, such as explicit language aptitude. Predictive validity refers to whether implicit aptitude is associated or predictive of learning outcomes. The colloquium includes both correlational studies that examine the associations between aptitude and ultimate learning attainment, as well as experimental studies that investigate the interface between aptitude and the effectiveness of different kinds of instructional treatments. The studies involve both learners from foreign language settings and learners from second language settings. The studies examine the validity of both classical measures of implicit aptitude, such as zero reaction time, and new measures of implicit language aptitude, such as syntactic priming. The colloquium seeks to bridge four different paradigms of implicit learning, including sequence learning, procedural memory, statistical learning, and syntactic priming. Okay, so here is a snapshot of the talks and their speakers and affiliations. So in the first talk, the speakers will present a study that examines the associations between implicit aptitude and implicit knowledge. The speakers are Aline Godfroid from Michigan State University and Kathy Kim from Boston University. In the second talk, I will present a study that examines the validity of syntactic priming as a measure of implicit language aptitude. The third study examines the validity of lambda as a measure of implicit language aptitude. The speaker is Yuichi Suzuki from Kanagawa University. In the fourth talk, the speakers will present a study that investigates the associations between implicit and explicit aptitude and the effectiveness of implicit and explicit corrective feedback. The speakers are Yucel Yilmaz from Indiana University and Gisela Granena from Universitat Oberta de Catalunya. In the fifth talk, the speakers will present a study on the reliability and validity of measures of procedural memory. The speakers are Morgan-Short, Josh Buffington, and Alex DeMose, all from the University of Illinois at Chicago. And finally, Nick Ellis, who is from the University of Michigan, will talk about to what extent the empirical studies have established the validity of implicit language aptitude. Okay, here is more information about the colloquium. So each talk will last approximately 20 minutes. And you're welcome to participate in the talks and the colloquium by posting your questions on the discussion board. You could also email the speakers to communicate with them. And finally, enjoy the talks and enjoy the conference. And thank you very much. That's all for the brief introduction to the colloquium.
Thank you for coming to our talk. This is our 5th take. We turned all the notifications off and we upgraded our Zoom to the latest version, so we should be all set to go. Today, Aline and I will be talking about implicit statistical learning aptitude and its relation to implicit second language knowledge. Next slide, perfect. Overall, we had 2 aims for this current study. The first aim was to examine the aptitude and knowledge association. In particular, we were interested in those different types of implicit statistical learning tasks predict implicit second language knowledge. In other words, we were interested in predictive validity of implicit statistical learning aptitude. And the second aim of our current study was related to the construct of implicit statistical learning aptitude. In particular, are different types of implicit statistical learning skills interrelated? In other words, are they a unitary construct, or are they tapping into different components of implicit statistical learning? Okay, great. So a little bit more about implicit statistical learning aptitude. Implicit statistical learning aptitude is one's ability to pick up regularities in the environment. So for instance, being able to segment word boundaries and also being able to pick up patterns in artificial languages. And this implicit statistical learning aptitude presumes to take place incidentally without consciousness, so without intention to learn and without awareness of the irregularities that are hidden underneath the stimuli. And also, this implicit statistical learning aptitude is a possible mechanism by which individuals acquire implicit linguistic knowledge. Therefore, we hypothesize that those with greater implicit statistical learning skills will be able to develop more implicit knowledge than those who have lower implicit statistical learning skills. Okay. So I would like to talk a little bit about the constructs of implicit statistical learning aptitude. So traditionally, the skill has been conceptualized as a unified construct where learning from different modalities, such as through vision or audition or different sense of touch, they are interrelated, and there is therefore a common learning mechanism that helps extract patterns across these different modes of input. But recently, there have been evidence showing that implicit statistical learning aptitude is multidimensional. In other words, it is modality specific, in a sense that when we encode information through different modalities, it is modality constrained in a sense that we rely on different parts of our body, and also it invokes different parts of our brain. So it is modality specific in that sense. But once this information is encoded through different modes, it goes through this domain general processing principle, which extracts common patterns or regularities across these input modes. So that's what we were saying about this implicit statistical learning aptitude is modality specific, but it also is subject to domain general processing principles. Okay. So one of our aim was to, again, examine the association between different types of aptitude and different types of knowledge. So here I'm going to briefly go over 3 types of knowledge. Starting from the bottom, explicit knowledge is conscious verbalizable knowledge of forms and regularities. And we could develop this type of knowledge typically through grammar instructions. And access to this knowledge is slow and effortful because we relied on control processes. However, through practice, this explicit knowledge becomes automatized, where we still have this conscious verbalizable knowledge of the rules, but we could access this more rapidly. And of course, there is implicit knowledge, which is unconscious knowledge of linguistic rules. We gain this mainly through exposure to rich input, and we could use this knowledge very spontaneously and intuitively. And when it comes to different types of knowledge, we cannot ignore test validity. In other words, what measures are valid measures of explicit knowledge, automatized explicit knowledge, and implicit knowledge. And Rod Ellis's 2000 in his 2005 article, he proposed a 2-factor model where the timed accuracy measure that we see on the left-hand side of the model was proposed to be an implicit knowledge measure, whereas the untimed accuracy measure that you see on the right-hand side of the model was defined as explicit knowledge measures. Since Rod Ellis's 2005 paper, series of studies looked into this very question of what are valid measures of different types of knowledge. And in 2017, Yuichi Suzuki and Robert de Keyser proposed a different model from Ellis 2005, where they claimed that the 3-timed accuracy measure that was proposed to be implicit knowledge measure from Ellis 2005 could be measuring automatized explicit knowledge instead. And Suzuki and de Keyser proposed that the reaction time measures could be tapping onto implicit knowledge instead. So again, we had two overall aims for the current study. And the first research question was about the convergent validity of implicit statistical learning aptitude. In particular, to what extent do different measures of implicit statistical learning aptitude interrelate? And the second is about the predictive validity of implicit statistical learning aptitude. To what extent do measures of implicit statistical learning aptitude predict explicit knowledge, automatized explicit knowledge, and implicit knowledge? And into the methods. We had 131 participants. Their average TOEFL score was 96. So overall, the participants were quite advanced language learners. And the average length of residence in an English-speaking country was 42 months. And half of our participants were Chinese international students. And in this study, we employed 4 implicit statistical learning aptitude measure to obtain a more comprehensive assessment of learners' implicit statistical learning aptitude. And these 4 measures were visual statistical learning, auditory statistical learning, and also alternating serial reaction time task, which a lot of SLA researchers use to measure implicit learning aptitude. And lastly, the Tower of London measure. And our participants came to our lab 3 times. In our first session, they completed 4 linguistic knowledge measures: word monitoring, self-paced reading, timed oral GJT, untimed oral GJT. And in the second session, they completed 3 timed accuracy measure, in particular the oral production, illicit imitation, and time written GJT, along with untimed written GJT and metalinguistic knowledge test. And during their last visit, they completed the 4 implicit statistical learning measures, and also the paired associate MLAT5, which was not included in our current study and the analysis of our current study. And Aline will be presenting the results.
Thank you, Kathy. So I will be presenting the results as will be published soon in a forthcoming article this summer 2021 in Studies in Second Language Acquisition. So let's have a look, starting with the first research question of convergent validity. We started the analysis by running a correlation analysis of our 4 different implicit statistical learning aptitude measures. What you see here is the correlation matrix in which 2 things stand out. First, we observed a medium strong correlation between the visual and the auditory statistical learning measures, nearly 0.5 correlation. With the exception of this correlation, all the other associations between measures were quite weak and not statistically significant, which already is suggesting to us that any evidence for convergent validity of our measures is likely to be limited. We confirmed these preliminary conclusions from the correlation analyses through an exploratory factor analysis in which we extracted 3 factors from our different tests. The first factor represents the alternating serial reaction time task, which is loading all by itself. The second factor is accounted for by the Tower of London, again loading all by itself onto a separate factor. And finally, consistently with what we found in the correlation analysis, visual and auditory statistical learning are loading together onto the same factor. So together, what these findings suggest then is that the support for the convergent validity of our different implicit statistical learning aptitude measures in this study was limited. Specifically, the auditory and visual statistical learning measures were the only 2 measures in the study that converged. And so with this knowledge, we then proceeded to examine the predictive validity of our 4 different aptitude measures. And what I'm going to show you now are 2 confirmatory factor analyses, CFA models that provided the measurement part, the measurement model of our final analysis. And so on the left, you see an extension of the Ellis 2005 model that Kathy introduced to you previously. And on the right, we have an extension of the Suzuki and the Kaiser model. These models differ in that they have 2 versus 3 factors of linguistic knowledge respectively. And so when we compare these 2 models, what we find is in fact a slight advantage for the more parsimonious 2-factor model. The BIC value here is lower, which indicates a better fit of the two-factor model, even though we should note that the difference between the two models is fairly small. So these are the measurements models we'll be working with, and we will be using those in two larger structural equation models. Again, the goal here is to assess the differential contributions of implicit statistical learning aptitudes to different types of linguistic knowledge. I will present the results of two models, the Ellis two-factor model, which is our final model in the study, as well as, for comparison, the Suzuki and the Kaiser model, which may help us interpret the results of the Ellis model more fully. And so, just as a reminder, the crucial difference between these two models is how the reaction time tests are being accounted for. In the two-factor Ellis model, they load together with the timed accuracy-based test onto the same factor called implicit knowledge, whereas in the three-factor model, the extension of Suzuki and the Kaiser, they load onto a separate factor from the measures of from the timed accuracy-based tests. So let's have a look at what we found. This is the two-factor SEM model. The part on the right you've seen before, so it's the part on the left, the structural model that we are now focusing on. And so what we see here is a significant path going from the alternating serial reaction time task to implicit knowledge. Furthermore, none of the other implicit statistical learning aptitude measures predicted either type of knowledge significantly. Now, if we take a look at the three factors SEM model, we observe a very similar result. This time, the alternating serial reaction time task is predicting automatized explicit knowledge. Why do I say that the result between of these two analyses is similar? Well, because in both cases, the ASRT predicts the factor that on which the timed accuracy-based tests load. So you see that here for the two-factor model, we see the same thing. For the three-factor model, ASRT accounts for performance on the timed oral and written grammaticality judgment tests, as well as elicit imitation and oral production. This indicates then that we have support for the predictive validity of this task as a measure of implicit statistical learning aptitude, and at the same time also support for the construct validity of the timed accuracy-based tests as measures of implicit. So then what does this all mean for the construct of implicit statistical learning aptitude? First of all, with regard to the convergent validity, we found limited support for the convergent validity of our different measures, in particular for the convergent validity of the two statistical learning aptitude measures. In this regard, our results were very similar to those of Ziegelman et al. 2017-2018, who reported very similar correlations, same strength between these two measures. This result then suggests that even though there were modality differences, right? The two tests differed in the modality in which they were assessing learning. In spite of these modality differences, we were able to observe empirically the work of the underlying domain general processing mechanisms guiding the extraction of statistical regularities in these two tests. So we found evidence for the domain generality of statistical learning, of statistical learning mechanisms. One result that we found surprising in this study is that the two statistical learning measures did not correlate with the alternating serial reaction time task, even though the type of learning feature, learning target in this task was actually in its nature very similar to that of the statistical learning measures. So both tasks involve the learning of transitional probabilities, so the learning of statistical sequential information in the input. Nonetheless, we did not find performance on the two measures to relate. Finally, the Tower of London did not relate to the other measures in our test battery either, and this finding coincided with the one reported by Buffington and Morgan-Short, also here at the symposium. So when it comes to the construct of implicit statistical learning aptitude, then there is no strong evidence to suggest that it is a unitary mechanism, and thus results obtained with one measure should not be generalized to the construct at large, but rather interpreted with reference to the specific aptitude test that was used. So for instance, with regard to the alternating serial reaction time task in the present study. For a more comprehensive picture, the use of multiple tests is certainly recommended. And if this is not possible to time constraint or financial constraints, the ASRT may in fact be the best single test option that is out there for us researchers. With regard to the predictive validity of our four measures, that was supported for the alternating serial reaction time task, which predicted performance on the timed accuracy-based tests, timed auditory and written GJT, elicited imitation and oral production. These tests are in wide use in the lab, the classroom, and assessment contexts. And so this is basically affirming their validity. At the same time, our models also indicated that even though the Ellis model was a better fit for our data and was ultimately the final model that we interpret, neither model really accounted well for the reaction time tasks. And so you see that here, this is an enlarged version of detail from the Ellis model, as well as Suzuki and de Casa's models. The factor loadings are low, and with one exception, they are also statistically non-significant. And so this suggests that further research in this area is certainly needed, and that our current understanding of the validity of these measures may be lacking. Claims in the literature that reaction time measures inherently by their nature measure implicit knowledge are therefore best considered as preliminary. And I think that in future research, what would need to be prioritized is the reliability of these instruments and how we extract measures of individual ability, of an individual's ability from them. And so thus far, this has always been done with sensitivity scores, different scores, but there may be better options that have become available. So to summarize, what we found and what we'd like you to walk away with from this presentation, we found limited support for the convergent validity of our different measures. And so the theme of the present symposium is implicit language aptitude. And so we want to bear in mind the importance of the different measures that are used to assess it, and the real possibility that the results from one measure may not generalize to the construct at large. The alternating serial reaction time task then proved also, to benefit. So was supported in terms of its predictive validity as an implicit statistical learning aptitude measures, and at the same time, so were the timed accuracy-based tests that have been in wide use in SLA at least since 2005. Finally, More research will be needed on the reaction time tasks. We very much look forward to that. And in fact, what we would really love to see is a reanalysis of the present data using mixed model techniques that have become available and that allow for the extraction of random slopes to measure participants' individual's ability. So although our results painted a certain picture, we think that the debate on the validity of reaction time measures is far from being settled. And we look forward to being a part of the ongoing conversation. Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank the funders, Language Learning, as well as MSU Center for Language Teaching Advancement, as well as all the students and alumni at MSU who helped with the materials, developing the data collection, and also some coding and analysis. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this talk. In this talk, I'm going to present a study that explores syntactic priming as a measure of implicit language aptitude, which refers to the ability for learning a second language unconsciously. So the study explores the validity of syntactic priming as a measure of implicit aptitude from 3 perspectives, which are convergent validity, which refers to whether it's correlated with other measures of implicit aptitude. Divergent validity refers to whether it's distinct from or uncorrelated with measures of other constructs, such as explicit aptitude. Predictive validity refers to whether it's correlated or predictive of learning outcomes or L2 proficiency. Okay, so let me start by defining and exemplifying syntactic priming. Syntactic priming refers to the tendency to reuse a structure experienced by someone recently. Okay, so for example, after hearing the sentence, the professor gave a book to the student, one is more likely to say the tour guide showed a map to the woman instead of the tour guide showed the woman a map, which is equally correct. The research on syntactic priming has focused on using priming as a task for examining the mechanism of speech production, such as whether priming is effective and what are the constraining factors for its effectiveness. In this study, the perspective I adopted is whether priming can be used as a measure of implicit learning ability. Okay, so researchers argue that syntactic priming involves implicit learning because it does not require any effort for conscious processing and retrieval of information. And there is evidence showing that syntactic priming indeed involves implicit learning. For example, it involves syntactic abstraction rather than the semantic connections between the prime and the target. It involves syntax rather than lexicon. So the argument is that syntax is likely implicit, whereas semantics and lexicon are likely explicit. And there is always also evidence that syntactic priming is distinct from explicit learning. For example, learners with intact procedural memory did perfectly on syntactic priming tasks, but they did poorly on tasks requiring them to recall past events because of their deficits in declarative memory, which is a kind of explicit learning ability. Okay, so the focus of this study is whether priming can be used as a measure of implicit language aptitude. Implicit language aptitude refers to a cluster of abilities for unconscious second language learning. Implicit aptitude has been measured by using serial reaction time tasks and llama-D. SRT, or serial reaction time, has been found to be predictive of learning outcomes. However, the test appears unrelated to language learning, which involves form meaning mapping. And llama-D has been found to be an inconsistent measure of implicit aptitude. So syntactic priming has the potential of being an ideal measure of implicit aptitude because it involves implicit learning and it involves form meaning mapping, which is a defining feature of language learning. However, as I pointed out earlier, priming has been used as a task for examining the mechanism of speech production instead of as a measure of cognitive ability. Okay, to achieve the goal of the research, 3 research questions were formulated. The first question concerns the convergent validity of syntactic priming, that is, whether it is correlated with other measures of implicit aptitude. The second question is about the divergent validity of syntactic priming, namely whether it is distinct from or uncorrelated with explicit aptitude. The third question concerns the predictive validity of syntactic priming as a measure of implicit aptitude, that is, whether it is predictive of learning outcomes. Okay, moving on to methods. The study involved 166 EFL learners at a large Chinese university. They took 3 tests of implicit aptitude, including priming, llama-D, and serial reaction time. They also took 3 tests of explicit aptitude, including llama-B, E, and F. And they also took 3 tests of L2 proficiency, including grammaticality judgment, elicited imitation, and metalinguistic knowledge. Okay, let me provide further explanation for the syntactic priming task that I used. The test or task included 128 items, including 64 target items and 64 distractors. Okay, so during the test for each trial or each item, the learner listened to a sentence and then repeated the sentence. And then the learner was asked to or saw a picture and then asked to describe the picture verbally. So if priming was effective, then the learner would use the target structure used in the priming sentence instead of the alternative. And 2 structures were built or embedded in the stimuli. These 2 structures are transitive verbs, which basically refers to active voice and passive voice. And the other structure is dative construction, which has 2 variants as well, prepositional object and double object. Okay, let me talk more about the other tests I used in the study. So in addition to syntactic priming, the other 2 measures of implicit aptitude are serial reaction time and llama-D. So in serial reaction time, learners were asked to respond to a black dot that appeared on 4 different locations. And the locations were based on 2 sequences. One, which is called target sequence, was more frequent in the stimuli. And the other one, which is called control sequence, was less frequent. And learners' performance on this test was calculated by subtracting their reaction times for the target sequence from their mean reaction times for the control sequence. In the llama-D test, learners listened to some 1-syllable sound sequences, and then they were asked to recognize those sounds. Okay, I used the other 3 subtests of the llama battery to measure explicit aptitude, operationalized as rote memory, phonetic coding, and analytic ability. Okay, I used an illicit imitation test to measure implicit knowledge. During the test, learners listened to some English sentences read by a native speaker, and then they were asked to repeat the sentences in correct English. So some of the sentences were ungrammatical and some were grammatical. Okay, I used two tests to measure explicit knowledge. One is grammaticality judgment. It's an untimed test in which learners were asked to judge the grammaticality of some sentences, and they made a correction for a sentence or for sentences which were ungrammatical. In the meta-linguistic knowledge test, they were given some ungrammatical sentences, and for each ungrammatical sentence, they were given 4 descriptions of the violation of a grammar rule. And then they were asked to choose the most appropriate description. Okay, moving on to results. So first, let's look at the identified model regarding the relationship between implicit and explicit aptitude. So as you can see, the hypothesized model was not confirmed. And this is the identified model, which is different from the model that I hypothesized. So in this model, the 3 measures of implicit aptitude were uncorrelated, except for the fact that there was a weak negative correlation between priming and sequence learning. So priming, sequence learning, and Lamma-D failed to converge on the same factor. And Lamma-D actually turned out to be a measure of explicit aptitude. So this diagram shows the results relating to the first 2 research questions, which asked whether syntactic priming has convergent and divergent validity. So let me summarize the results on this slide. So first of all, in terms of divergent validity, the results show that priming indeed has divergent validity because it is uncorrelated with measures of explicit aptitude. However, there was no evidence for convergent validity because the measures of implicit aptitude, including syntactic priming, Lamma-D, and sequence learning, were uncorrelated. Okay, there was even a negative correlation between priming and serial reaction time or sequence learning, which were both hypothesized to be measures of implicit aptitude. And Lamma-D actually converged with measures of explicit aptitude. So it was a measure of explicit aptitude instead of implicit aptitude. Okay, the results show strong convergent validity for explicit aptitude because all the measures of or all measures which were hypothesized to measure explicit aptitude converged on the same factor. They loaded on the same factor. Okay, let me present the model relating to the relationship between aptitude and L2 proficiency. So these are actually results relating to the 3rd research question, which is whether syntactic priming has predictive validity, whether it's predictive of L2 proficiency. And this is the identified model. I have to say that the model did not confirm the hypothesis I had regarding the relationships between the aptitude measures and proficiency measures. So as you can see, priming and sequence learning, which were hypothesized to measure implicit aptitude, were not predictive of elicited imitation, which was hypothesized to measure implicit knowledge. They were not predictive of any proficiency measures. Well, actually, sequence learning was a negative predictor of metalinguistic knowledge. As you can see from this diagram, elicited imitation loaded with the 2 measures of explicit knowledge. So basically, it was found to be a measure of explicit knowledge. because it converged with the measures of explicit knowledge. On the other hand, explicit aptitude was a strong and significant predictor of L2 proficiency, represented by illicit imitation, GJT, and metalinguistic knowledge. So let me summarize the results for the third research question. So priming was not predictive of any proficiency measure. Serial reaction time predicted a measure of proficiency, but it was a negative predictor of metalinguistic knowledge. Yeah, well, yeah, it was a predictor, but was the negative predictor. In terms of the measures of proficiency, elicited imitation, which was hypothesized to measure implicit knowledge, turned out to be a measure of explicit knowledge. Okay, explicit aptitude was a strong predictor of proficiency. Okay, moving on to discussion. So what do we make of the results? Well, first of all, there was no evidence for convergent validity. This is because the three measures of implicit aptitude did not converge. They did not load on the same factor. Actually, lemma D loaded on the same factor as the three measures of explicit aptitude. There was a negative correlation between priming and serial reaction time, although they were hypothesized to measure the same thing, the same construct, which is implicit aptitude. Okay, so why was there a negative correlation between priming and serial reaction time? Well, I think basically they tap into different mechanisms. Priming taps into the ability to be influenced by a previous event, especially a less frequent structure. So it's basically about the ability to break the norm, to quit an old habit, whereas serial reaction time or sequence learning is about the ability to form a new habit based on repeated practice. And secondly, priming is measured by using a verbal task, so it's linguistic, and serial reaction time is a non-linguistic task or a non-verbal task, so they're different in that aspect. Also, priming is based on accuracy, whereas serial reaction time is based on latency or reaction time. In psychological research, there is evidence that accuracy and time-based measures normally do not converge. I mean, they are not aligned. Okay, so this finding provides further evidence for the lack of convergent validity for measures of implicit aptitude or implicit learning. And the studies by Buffington et al. And Godfroid and Kim included in this Colloquium obtained similar findings. Okay, so in terms of divergent validity, yeah, priming indeed has divergent validity because it is not correlated with explicit aptitude. So priming likely involves implicit learning because there is evidence for such a claim. In the study, no learners were aware of the target structures of the priming task, and there was no semantic connection between primes and targets in the test. There is also no lexical boost. That is, there was no lexical overlap between priming sentences and target sentences or target stimuli. SRT or sequence learning also has divergent validity. It is not correlated with any measure of explicit aptitude. However, lemma D did not show divergent validity because it loaded on the same factor as measures of explicit aptitude. Okay, in terms of predictive validity, measures of implicit aptitude were not correlated with proficiency. Of course, syntactic priming was not predictive of proficiency either. Well, I guess this is partly because of the nature of the knowledge possessed by the participants or by the learners who received heavy doses of form-focused instruction. So basically, the knowledge they had is primarily explicit instead of implicit. And this explanation is confirmed by other studies, such as the study by Godfroid and Kim, who found that SRT was a positive predictor or a significant predictor of implicit knowledge, because those learners had some implicit knowledge at least. Okay, sequence learning was a negative predictor of meta-linguistic knowledge, which is not surprising. So the result suggests that sequence learning as a measure of implicit aptitude is not only uncorrelated with explicit knowledge, but also it may have a negative impact on meta-linguistic knowledge, because implicit and explicit learning are fundamentally different, and they work through different mechanisms. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about the validity of explicit aptitude. So in this study, explicit aptitude showed strong convergent validity. All measures of explicit aptitude converged on the same factor, and lemma D also loaded on the factor of explicit aptitude. However, the factor loading of lemma D was the lowest among the 4 tests that loaded on the same factor. Okay, explicit aptitude also had a strong predictive validity. It was a strong and significant predictor of L2 proficiency, confirming previous findings about explicit aptitude. So previous research has found that explicit aptitude is a consistent and significant predictor of explicit learning, the effects of explicit instruction, and explicit knowledge. One striking finding about explicit aptitude is that it is more important in initial learning than learning that happens at more advanced stages of learning. Okay, that's all for my presentation. Thank you very much for watching this talk. And if you have any questions, feel free to post your questions on the platform. There will be a platform which is not available yet, or you can just email me. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Yuichi Suzuki from Kanagawa University in Japan. Today, I'd like to talk about a subtest of popular aptitude test, lemma D. Lemma D is proposed as an aptitude test for implicit learning, and I provide some evidence against that view in this talk. Because we are still in the very early phase of studying implicit aptitude, I hope some of my approaches, here indicated in the subtitles, incidental instructions, confidence ratings, and reaction time measures, they will be useful for stimulating this emerging subdomain of aptitude research, which is the theme of this colloquium. Let me talk about a little bit about background of the lemma test. Lemma test is increasingly being used in part because it is freely available and language independent. Evaluation of the lemma test reliability and validity has recently commenced. Potential and limits are gradually emerging. Lemma D is very different from the other subtest component of lemma test, B, E, and F. They tend to correlate each other, while lemma D is not related to any of these subcomponents. Lemma B, E, and F involve the deliberate study phase of linguistic stimuli, whereas lemma D includes a simple and brief exposure phase. Let me show you a little bit about what Llama-D involves. It consists of two phases. First, participants are exposed to 10 sound sequences in the exposure phase, and in the following test phase, they listen to 30 sequences one by one and judge whether they have heard it, familiar old items, or not, new items. A recent large-scale validation study conducted by Bukander and Byland 2019 revealed that old and new items loaded onto different factors, suggesting that these two types of test items might indicate different types of abilities. And Granena 2019 proposed a very interesting hypothesis that Llama-D can capture individual differences in some aspects of implicit memory. Here's a quote: "Learning conditions created by the test, or like Llama-D, are closer to implicit induction, that is, acquiring patterns intentionally through exposure, than explicit induction, that is, figuring out rules and relations. And test takers respond to test prompts based on feelings of familiarity involving fast and automatic processes rather than unconscious recollection involving slow and controlled search processes." And in order to further probe this Granena's hypothesis, I'd like to scrutinize the validity claim for Llama-D as an implicit aptitude test with special attention paid to three methodological features: incidental instructions, confidence ratings, and reaction time measures. Let's first take a look at incidental instructions. The Llama-D instructions provided in the Llama test manual in MIRA 2005, they state that your task is listen carefully to these words, and in the test phase of the program, you will hear these words alongside other words that you have not heard before. So this instruction told participants to pay attention to linguistic stimuli, and they know that they will be tested after the exposure phase. On the other hand, a recent study by Saito explored the possibility of modifying the wording to render these instructions more incidental. He asked participants to focus on the sound in the exposure phase without any indication that they would be tested later. In the current study, I followed Saito's incidental instructions to create more incidental learning conditions of the Llama-D. Next one is confidence ratings. And in cognitive psychology, subjective measures of consciousness were used by confidence ratings. And they believe that confidence rating can dissociate conscious and unconscious knowledge. And accuracy and confidence ratings are positively correlated when responses are based on conscious knowledge. On the other hand, no such relationship is expected for those tapping into unconscious knowledge. In order to explore the unconscious knowledge that may or may not be acquired from the Llama-D, in the current study, participants were required to report their confidence levels for each test item by modifying the original Llama-D test. And the last point is reaction time measures, because Llama-D doesn't have any reaction time measure component and it only measures accuracy. I decided to include reaction time measures because reaction time is captured to infer the implicit or unconscious behavior. And Granena 2019 found that implicit memory measured by the composite score or the original Llama-D accuracy score and reaction time measure from a different implicit aptitude test called ALTM, Available Long-Term Memory Test, which is part of the HiLab test. It's a assortment of aptitude test battery. And these composite score of implicit memory was a significant predictor of L2 speaking ability measured by utterance fluency. That is an objective measurement of fluency performance. And utterance fluency is commonly associated with proceduralization and automatization of the linguistic knowledge. And in the current study, I investigated the extent to which accuracy score and reaction time score of the modified Llama-D test can predict speaking fluency. Now on to the current study. The goal of the current study is to scrutinize the construct validity of Llama-D as a measure of implicit learning aptitude. I made 3 modifications to the original Llama-D test. First, I changed the instructions for more incidental learning following Saito's study. Second, confidence ratings of test responses were added. Lastly, I also measured reaction time of test responses. Because I made these 3 modifications to the original Llama-D test, the current study may not be considered as a validation study with the original Llama-D test per se, but these modifications were made to explore its potential and limits. I posed 3 research questions in the study. First, do the old and new items of Llama-D assess different aspects of sound recognition ability? Second, are confidence ratings associated with accuracy and reaction time measures of Llama-D? Third, is utterance fluency, which is an indication of proceduralization in speaking, associated with Llama-D accuracy and reaction time measures? I recruited 59 EFL learners at a Japanese university, and their English proficiency was estimated to range from A2 elementary to B1 intermediate level of the CFL benchmark. They took the Llama-D test and the speaking test in the laboratory setting, and the speaking test was a narrative task based on a 6-frame cartoon. Here's a procedure of the modified Llama-D. The modified Llama-D was implemented using the psychology experimental tool, DMDX. In the exposure phase, participants were instructed to check the sound volume before they listened to 10 new words in order to encourage more incidental learning. In the following unannounced surprise test, the test consists of a discrimination task and confidence ratings. In the test phase of this discrimination component, participants were asked to indicate whether the sequence of word they heard was new or familiar or old items from the exposure phase. And followed by each discrimination judgment, they had to indicate their confidence levels on a 4-point scale. So no confidence at all, and slightly confident, and very confident, and 100% confident. Because some participants did not fully use all these 4 scales, I decided to dichotomize into high confident and low confidence ratings. So I combined not confident at all and slightly confident as low confident, and very confident and 100% confident as a high confident rating for further analysis. In the data analysis, a mean reaction time was computed only for correct responses, because reaction times associated with incorrect responses may not reflect the same underlying cognitive processes. In addition to the speed measures, so reaction time, I also computed the coefficient of variance for each reaction time of each participant, and CB, coefficient variance, served as a processing efficiency index. The CV, which is computed as the ratio of participants' mean SD of RT and mean reaction time. This CV may be similar to reaction time, but they should capture different dimensions of Llama-D performance. Broadly speaking, reaction time is an indicator of processing speed. On the other hand, CV indicates more like a stability of processing after correcting for processing speed. They should tap into different dimensions of Llama-D performance. And here is a speaking test I used, which is an oral narrative task based on the 6-frame cartoon, and I measured articulation rate and mid-close pause duration. Both of them reflect proceduralization or automatization of L2 speech. Now on to the results and discussion. Then I first calculated the reliability of the Llama-D test, and I found a very low Cronbach alpha, 0.2. However, when I split the Llama-D test items into familiar old items and new items, their respective reliability scores increased to 0.55 and 0.47. And principal component analysis also suggested the new and old items clustered separately, which is consistent with Bokander and Byland's 2019 findings. Now, the second research questions asked about the relationship between accuracy and reaction time measures from Llama-D and the confidence ratings. I ran 2x2 repeated measure ANOVA, confidence rating high and low, and item type old and new. And I found a significant effect of confidence ratings with large effect size on both accuracy and reaction time, which suggests that higher confidence rating was associated with higher accuracy and faster speed on the test items. I also detected a significant interaction between confidence levels and item type only for accuracy measures. And this interaction is graphically illustrated in this figure. As you can see, the confidence rating was significantly related to the accuracy of these familiar items, but not the new items. So what does this finding suggest? Based on the positive relationship between confidence ratings and test performance, the validity of Llama-D as an implicit aptitude measure is challenged. Item recognition of old items presumably requires conscious recollection of previously encountered stimuli. And if Llama-D measures conscious recognition memory, it can simply be a measure of explicit rather than implicit memory. And Llama-D and utterance fluency associations, when I first computed a correlation between Llama-D accuracy, reaction time, and CV, I found no significant relationship with articulation rate or mid-close pause durations. However, when I split the items of Llama-D into old items and new items following the reliability analysis, like they behave completely differently, old and new items, then I found a significant positive correlation between CV of our old items and mid-close pause duration. So it looks like the CV of Llama-D of familiar items predicted the fluency, or that is like manifestation of proceduralization. And Llama-D taps into the ability to not only accurately recognize a sequence of words, but also the ability to do it quickly and perhaps more importantly, efficiently, which may help play a pivotal role in L2 proceduralization. Interestingly, the CV of old items was particularly sensitive to mid-close pause duration, which suggests that efficient processing of familiar items can be linked to proceduralization or automatization of existing L2 knowledge or familiar items. Given the scarcity of aptitude measurements for proceduralization, its importance for L2 learning, this exploratory investigation can stimulate further pursuit of this line of thinking. And future directions. First, the incidental instructions result in a much lower internal consistency of Llama-D compared to that reported in previous research using the original instructions. Familiar and new items tap into distinct underlying abilities, thus, rather than using a composite scores should be reported separately for new and old items in the Llama test. reaction time and CV can potentially be useful as useful indicators of individual differences in the aptitude for proceduralization, because LR reaction time has been utilized in the existing implicit learning aptitude test. Reaction time measures should be explored further in aptitude test development, given its extensive use in psycholinguist L2 research. So conclusions. The findings yielded by this exploratory study cast doubt on the validity of Llama-D as a measure of implicit aptitude. Llama-D may not be construed as an aptitude measure of proceduralization. Llama-D may be construed as an aptitude measure of proceduralization in the domain of L2 acquisition, that is, consolidation of linguistic constructions for more fluent L2 use. The current study is not a validation of the original Llama-D per se, and possible modifications and more test refinement may be beneficial for future research. Utilizing reaction time CV and separating familiar and new items and increasing the number of exposure and test items may be interesting areas of further exploration. And this is the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for listening.
Hello everyone and welcome. In this colloquium paper, we will present the results of a project we have been working on for some years now, and that looked at the role of implicit and explicit cognitive abilities in the effectiveness of corrective feedback. In this project, we understand language aptitude as cognitive language aptitude and as a set of cognitive abilities that can explain individual variation in L2 learning. The conceptualization of aptitude has changed over the years. The prevailing view in the field of SLA has been Carroll's model of aptitude, and more specifically, the abilities measured by the MLAT test battery. This view of aptitude that has influenced the field of SLA for decades sees aptitude as a combination of domain-specific abilities that rely on explicit cognitive processes. More recently, and thanks to advances in cognitive psychology and changes in the understanding of how languages are learned, aptitude has been reconceptualized and operationalized as also including cognitive abilities in the implicit domain. The HiLab aptitude test battery is an example of this view. In this project, we defined language aptitude as a combination of implicit and explicit cognitive abilities. Implicit language aptitude includes cognitive abilities that involve cognitive processes labeled in the literature as automatic, associative, sensitive to a statistical covariation, non-conscious, and unintentional. They place minimal demands on the central executive and are relevant to learn a language through exposure by acquiring patterns unintentionally. Explicit language aptitude, on the other hand, includes cognitive abilities that involve attention-driven memory processes and that are relevant to learn a language explicitly and intentionally through reasoning, deliberate hypothesis testing, and memorization. Bearing in mind that aptitude is a multifaceted and complex construct, this two-system view of aptitude may be simplistic, but distinguishing between these two types of aptitude was useful in our case and had several advantages, as I will explain next. The first advantage of the distinction between implicit and explicit cognitive abilities is that they show minimal overlap, as suggested by several studies that have reported weak to zero correlations between abilities such as working memory or psychometric intelligence and implicit inductive learning or implicit memory measures. The second advantage is that even though the implicit-explicit distinction may be a simplification, it is a recurrent dichotomy in the field of SLA. As a result, we can have research designs combining explicit-implicit aptitudes and explicit-implicit learning conditions. And these designs can provide indirect evidence regarding the learning processes that are engaged in or that are responsible for the learning outcomes observed. A research paradigm that allows examining the extent to which an outcome depends on an individual's specific aptitudes is ATI, Aptitude Treatment Interaction. According to the ATI research paradigm, the effect of a treatment is optimal when the treatment and an individual's aptitude are matched. In the context of research on L2 learning, this allows for the formulation of dissociations between instructional or learning conditions and cognitive aptitudes. Dissociations, single or double, aim at providing evidence of separate mental processes. A mental process required by A, but not by B, and or a mental process required by B, but not by A. In the field of SLA, there are studies that have investigated instructional or learning conditions and cognitive aptitudes, but most of them have focused on either two types of cognitive abilities and a single learning condition, or two learning conditions and a single aptitude. Designs that allow the formulation of double dissociations with two types of learning conditions and two types of cognitive abilities matched to the learning conditions are not common. A research synthesis that we carried out in 2018 on instructed SLA studies that included both an implicit and an explicit instructional condition and at least one cognitive ability showed that over 55% of these studies were in the area of corrective feedback. This suggests that corrective feedback has been one of the most frequently researched instructional features in relation to cognitive aptitudes. The results were pretty mixed and difficult to account for given the methodological differences in the studies regarding operationalization of feedback types, measurement of cognitive variables, target structures, but a trend that we pointed out was a relationship between learning outcomes in explicit feedback conditions, either explicit correction or metalinguistic information with or without reformulation, and an ability in the explicit cognitive domain, working memory or language analytic ability. We also pointed out the need for studies including implicit cognitive abilities and especially designs including explicit implicit instructional or learning conditions and explicit implicit cognitive abilities. The study we are reporting on and that was part of a larger project aimed precisely to investigate the relative effectiveness of implicit and explicit corrective feedback as a function of individual differences in cognitive aptitudes for implicit and explicit learning. The research question that guided the study was the following. Are there any differential effects of different cognitive aptitudes on the effectiveness of different types of feedback? The study used the pre-test, post-test randomized block design with a control group, and it included two stages. In stage 1, we administered tests of cognitive individual differences from the Llama and the HiLab batteries to 135 English learners of Spanish. At the end of the first data collection stage, these 135 learners were invited to participate in the second stage of the experiment and were randomly assigned to one of three groups: implicit feedback, explicit feedback, or control. In the second stage, a pretest, 2 treatment sessions, and an immediate post-test were administered to 113 participants. Here you can see a breakdown of all the tests that were administered in stage 1, in addition to the background questionnaire. In stage 2, that's when participants met with one of two native speakers of Spanish on 2 consecutive days to complete 2 treatment tasks, one task on day 1 and one task on day 2, plus the pretest post-test measures. There were 3 pretest post-test measures: a grammaticality judgment test, an oral production task, and a self-paced reading task. In this paper, we will be reporting the results of the grammaticality judgment test and the oral production task. Moving on to the participants, the initial pool included 135 English learners of Spanish in the US, but this number decreased to 113 in stage 2. Participants' age was 20 years on average, and we used the 2 general proficiency measures, a closed test and an oral description task, to determine that there were no differences in Spanish proficiency between the 3 groups: control, implicit feedback, and explicit feedback. 2 target structures in Spanish were selected: noun adjective gender agreement and differential object marking, based on their low communicative value and the fact that they are not easily acquired by English learners of Spanish. In the case of gender agreement, adjectives have to agree with the gender of their noun reference when they are overly marked. In the case of DOM, if a direct object is animate, specific, and definite, they need to be preceded by preposition a, like in John kissed the girl. Regarding the treatment tasks, each participant carried out 2 one-way information gap tasks in 2 different sessions. Content was presented in different randomized orders. Each slide set included 40 slides, 16 for gender agreement and 16 for DOM, plus 8 distractors. The implicit feedback provided was partial recasts, reformulating only the erroneous segment of the learner's utterance. And you can see an example here where the experimenter gives implicit feedback on a gender agreement error. The experimenter prevented learners from repeating or repairing their original non-target-like utterances after the feedback by directing their attention to something else. Here you can see an example of the explicit feedback provided in the study. The explicit group received explicit corrections following the formula, "It is not correct, you should say." The reformulations provided in the explicit correction group were also partial and were provided in the same way as reformulations in the implicit group. Moving on to the outcome measures, the GJT we used was written and untimed, and it included an error correction component. There were 48 items, and we used two versions, A and B, that were counterbalanced. We calculated reliability, and Cronbach's alpha showed that grammatical items were not discriminating so well as ungrammatical ones. So we decided to focus on ungrammatical items for the analysis. These were items that were correctly identified as ungrammatical and for which a correction was provided. In the oral production task, participants had to describe the difference between sets of two pictures, as you can see here. An accuracy score was computed based on the number of accurate responses divided by the total number of obligatory contexts created. The inter-rater reliability for 10% of the data was 96%. And now Yucel will walk you through the results of the study.
Hi, I would like to talk about the results of the study and discuss those results later on. So before we carried out the statistical analysis to answer our research question, we first carried out a principal component analysis with Verimax rotation to determine the underlying structure of the 8 measures. So the rotated solution produced 3 factors. 5 tests loaded on the first factor, paired associates, lemma B, E, F, and letter span. 2 tests loaded on the second factor, lemma D and ALTM, and 2 tests loaded on the third factor, SRT, serial reaction time, and letter span. Letter span loaded negatively on the third factor. So based on the similarities between the tests that loaded on the same factor, we named the first factor as explicit learning ability, the second as implicit memory ability, and the third as implicit learning ability. Here you see the descriptive statistics for the 3 factor scores by treatment groups: explicit learning ability, implicit memory ability, and implicit learning ability. There seems to be some differences in scores at a descriptive level, but these differences never reach the level of statistical significance. So different treatment groups are comparable in terms of explicit learning ability, implicit memory ability, and implicit learning ability. Here in this slide, you see 2 bar charts displaying the descriptive statistics for gender agreement scores. The one on the left is for the grammatical judgment test, and the one on the right is for the oral production test. We are not concerned about the details of these charts now. The important point for us here is whether the groups differed in their pretest scores. Because if they do, we cannot easily attribute the gains to the treatment. One way ANOVAs showed that the group's pretest scores didn't differ significantly from each other. This means that the groups were comparable in their starting levels. Again, here you see 2 bar charts for differential object marking scores. The one on the left is for the grammatical judgment, whereas the one on the right is for the oral production test. Again, we are only interested in here whether the groups are different on their pretest scores. And our analysis shows that they are not. So the groups are comparable. Next, we carried out 4 custom ANCOVAs in order to find out whether the 3 cognitive aptitudes interacted differently with the effectiveness of different feedback types. There was a different ANCOVA for each target structure and test type. Each column in this table represents the results of a different ANCOVA. Each ANCOVA model included group as the between subjects factor, 3 covariates, and the interaction effects between each cognitive ability and group. Since our research question asked whether different cognitive aptitudes were differentially related to learners' performance under different feedback conditions, we are only interested in the interaction effects that are presented in the bottom part of the table. As you can see, the analysis showed that there was a significant interaction between implicit learning ability and group in gender scores on the grammatical judgment test. And in addition, there was another significant interaction between explicit learning ability and group in differential object marking scores on the oral production test. So we found an interaction between implicit learning ability and group in gender agreement scores on the grammatical judgment test. We followed up on this on the interactions in 2 ways. We first ran correlations between learners' performance in each treatment condition and the cognitive ability. As can be seen in the table on the right, the only significant correlation was between implicit learning ability and learners' performance in the implicit feedback condition. The second analysis we carried out to follow up on the interaction involved estimating whether the group's averages differed at 3 different points of the cognitive ability. So at 1 standard deviation below the mean and at the mean of implicit learning ability, there were no significant differences between the groups. At 1 standard deviation above the mean of implicit learning ability, the implicit feedback group performed significantly better than both the explicit feedback and the control group, but there was no significant difference between the explicit feedback and the control group. The other interaction we found was between explicit language aptitude and feedback group in differential object marking scores on the oral production test. The correlation analysis shown on the right side of the screen didn't reveal any significant relationships, but the relationship between explicit language learning aptitude and learners' performance in the explicit group approached the level of significance. The analysis of simple slopes showed that at 1 standard deviation below the mean of explicit learning ability, both the implicit and explicit group significantly outperformed the control group. But there was no significant difference between the implicit feedback and the explicit feedback group. At the mean and 1 standard deviation above the mean of explicit learning ability, both the implicit and explicit group significantly outperformed the control group. And the explicit feedback group significantly outperformed the implicit feedback group. So in this study, we asked, are there any differential effects of different cognitive aptitudes on the effectiveness of feedback types? We identified 3 aptitude components based on a factor analysis and labeled them as explicit learning ability, implicit learning ability, and implicit memory ability. None of these aptitude components had a moderating effect on oral production, gender agreement, or grammatical judgment, differential object marking gain scores. However, implicit learning ability had a moderating effect on grammatical judgment, gender agreement gain scores, while explicit learning ability had a moderating effect on oral production, differential object marking gain scores. So these results mean that distinct cognitive abilities played a role under explicit and implicit learning conditions. Under explicit feedback, the ability for explicit learning, not the ability for implicit learning, played a role. Whereas under implicit feedback, the ability for implicit learning, not the ability for explicit learning, played a role. The reason why explicit learning ability played a role in the effectiveness of explicit feedback may be related to the directness of the message provided in the explicit feedback regarding the error and how the error should be repaired. The directness might have unambiguously conveyed the negative evidence. The directness of the feedback might have helped unambiguously conveying the negative evidence to the learners and put pressure on them to switch attention from meaning to form. As a result, the learners might have intentionally searched for rules, tested hypotheses consciously, and engaged in language analysis. The finding that implicit learning ability played a role under the implicit feedback condition might be related to the absence of directness and metalinguistic information in the implicit feedback. The lack of these two features might have helped those learners with higher implicit learning ability process feedback holistically and in context without the mediation of analytical and metalinguistic thinking. We should note that differential relationships were only observed for one of the two outcome measures in each target structure. The effect of implicit learning ability was observed on the grammatical judgment task, whereas the effect of explicit learning ability was observed on the oral production task. This finding is interesting because grammatical judgment tasks are generally expected to tap into explicit, whereas oral production tasks are expected to tap into implicit knowledge. So, as pointed out in the previous literature, there are no pure measures of either knowledge type. Tests cannot be expected to measure a single knowledge type. So it is possible that the oral production task and grammatical judgment task used in this study might have tapped the type of knowledge that they are not expected to tap. Of course, future research triangulating learning outcomes with awareness measures could throw more light on the type of knowledge measured by each of these tests. The relationship between the aptitude components and pretest post-test improvement changed depending on the target structure. Explicit learning ability facilitated the effect of explicit feedback in differential object marking, whereas implicit learning ability facilitated the effect of implicit feedback in gender agreement. The characteristics of the target forms might be responsible for this interaction. Differential object marking depends on the semantic notion of animacy. Animate direct objects are marked with a preposition, whereas inanimate ones are not marked. The fact that the distinction is based on a semantic property of the direct object may have contributed to making form meaning mapping more transparent. And it could be that learners with higher explicit learning ability, with their higher analytical ability, could have taken more advantage of this more salient target form. On the other hand, grammatical agreement is a formal feature that requires associating non-meaningful elements that co-occur. It could be that learners with higher implicit learning ability were better at picking up these elements in the implicit feedback in an unconscious, non-reflective way. So our studies showed that learning gains in the implicit feedback group were related to implicit but not explicit learning ability, and that learning gains in the explicit feedback group were related to explicit but not implicit learning ability. So these results have both theoretical and practical value. Theoretically, this study informs about the nature of the learning processes at work during the two instructional interventions and demonstrates that these processes were qualitatively different. Practically, it shows that differentiated instruction matched to learners' cognitive strengths may be more effective than instruction that is not differentiated according to learners' strengths. Thank you for listening.
Hi, thanks for having us be part of this symposium on implicit language aptitude. Today, Josh Buffington and I will be talking about research we conducted along with Alex Demos that specifically examines the reliability and validity of procedural memory assessments in second language learning research. So recent considerations of aptitude for second language include implicit language aptitude, defined as cognitive abilities that facilitate implicit learning and processing of L2. Now, procedural memory is one type of cognitive ability that subserves implicit learning and processing. More specifically, procedural memory is a learning and memory system that relies on the basal ganglia and associated circuitry to support the acquisition of cognitive and motor skills and habits. Independently from the implicit language aptitude literature, procedural memory has been posited to play a role in second language learning. And indeed, a recent meta-analysis of empirical work evidences a positive relationship between procedural memory and second language grammar at higher levels of experience. As this research about the role of procedural memory in L2 grows, so does the number of tasks that have been used to assess procedural memory learning ability, with the most commonly used task by my lab and by others being the Tower of London, the dual task weather prediction task, and the alternating serial reaction time task, which we'll describe further later in the presentation. Here we'd like to point out that although it is not inherently problematic to use multiple tasks, the conclusions from this area of research will only be as strong as the reliability and validity of the specific task being used. So what is the evidence for the reliability and validity of these tasks? In regard to reliability, some research shows generally acceptable reliability for this task, but for the most part, these findings are not based on the same measures from the task used in second language work. So there's an open question that remains as to whether the specific measures from these tasks used in L2 studies are reliable. In regard to validity, there's evidence that each of these tasks involves procedural memory to some extent because the learning characteristics of the task reflect procedural memory learning patterns, and also the neural substrates associated with these tasks reflect the neural substrates associated with procedural memory. But further evidence for the validity of these tasks as measures of procedural memory learning ability, at least as a broad construct, would come from examining their convergent and discriminant validity, where convergent validity would tell us, would look like whether the tasks are patterning together, and discriminant validity would look like the tasks are unrelated to performance on other tasks. So here the open question is whether these procedural memory learning ability tasks show convergent and discriminant validity. So to address these questions of reliability and validity in our study, we administered 3 procedural memory learning ability tasks using a within subjects design. We included the most commonly used procedural memory learning ability task from second language studies. And to test discriminant validity, we administered 3 declarative memory learning ability tasks, which were expected to reflect learning in the procedural memory learning and memory system, which relies on the hippocampus and associated circuitry and subserves memory for facts and personal experiences. And with this design, we addressed 3 research questions. First, in regard to reliability, do assessments of procedural memory learning ability demonstrate internal consistency? Next, related to convergent validity, do the assessments of procedural memory learning ability pattern positively together? And finally, related to discriminant validity, do assessments of procedural memory learning ability not pattern positively with assessments of declarative memory learning ability? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Josh for our methods and results.
Okay, hello everyone. So for this study, we had 119 participants who completed the study over 2 testing sessions. We used a partially counterbalanced order primarily to balance out fatigue effects from using one type of memory for too long. So next, I'll talk you through the tasks that we used. The first task is the alternating serial reaction task, or ASRT. In this task, participants were instructed to press a key corresponding to the location of a dog's head, which you see right here. The position of the dog's head alternated in a pattern such that every other trial was part of the pattern. So for example, if the pattern was 2, 1, 3, 4, with the numbers corresponding to locations, random trials would occur after each pattern trial. For our dependent measure, we looked at the difference score between random trials and pattern trials, such that if participants are learning, we should see faster reaction times and a larger difference score. The second procedural memory task was the weather prediction task, or WPT. We used a dual task version of the weather prediction task. In the WPT, participants were instructed to guess a fictional weather outcome given cue cards, and then they received feedback on their response. The dual task component was a tone counting task, which Fiordi and colleagues had shown shifts learning to be more engaged with procedural memory. So here's an example of a trial. Participants would see a cue card. So we can imagine, say, this combination of cards predicts sun with an 80% probability. So participants wouldn't be told that, but they would make their guess, and then they would get feedback on their response, whether it was correct or incorrect. For our dependent measure, we used accuracy on the final dual task block. The final procedural memory task was the Tower of London, or TOL. In this task, participants were instructed to match a goal configuration of colored circles. One important instruction is that they were told to plan their sequence of moves before initiating the first move. And this gave us a measure of initial think time. Participants also repeated the task in order to give us a measure of improvement. So here you see an example trial. Participants would be asked to solve this within 6 moves, plan their moves ahead before beginning a move to match this goal state. We had 2 dependent measures for the Tower of London. The first one, TOL imp block, was a measure of improvement in initial think time from the beginning to the end of a block. So it was a % speed up measure in planning time. The second measure, TOL imp normed, was a measure of overall improvement. This measure included the average total trial time on the second administration of the task that was standardized across participants. Finally, I'll talk you somewhat more briefly through the declarative memory tasks in this study. The first task is the Modern Language Aptitude Test, Part 5, or MLAT. Some of you may be familiar with this task. In this task, participants study a word pair list of Pseudo-Kurdish words along with their English translations. So after a 4-minute study period, they're then given a multiple choice test, and we used accuracy on that test as our dependent measure. The second declarative memory task was the Continuous Visual Memory Task, or CVMT. In this task, participants viewed abstract shapes and made old new judgments. In other words, recognition judgments as to whether they had seen the shape previously in the task or if the shape was new. For this measure, we used, for a dependent measure, we looked at accuracy, more specifically D prime, which is a common measure from signal detection theory that's often used in recognition memory paradigms. The last task of declarative memory was the DECLearn. In DECLearn, participants first began with an incidental encoding phase, so they weren't told this was a memory task or that there would be a test later. But they viewed drawings and they had to decide if the drawing was real or made up. Following this, they took a short 10-minute break, and then finally they took the surprise recognition task to test their memory for the drawings. And here, again, we use D prime to look at their accuracy of recognition memory. All right, so the last component of the methods, I will talk you through the analysis that we did. For research question 1, reliability, we generally excluded tasks that were below a threshold of reliability of 0.7. We calculated reliability using 2 different methods, depending on the type of dependent measure that was calculated. Specifically, for measures that were taken at the end of a task, we used Cronbach's alpha. However, for dependent measures taken over the whole task, we needed to control for learning that we expected to take place during the task. So in order to control for this, we used the Spearman-Brown split half coefficient, where each half included was balanced with items across the whole task. So each half that went into the split half reliability included items distributed evenly across the task. For research questions 2 and 3, our initial evidence came from a Spearman correlation matrix of intercorrelations among the measures, and our primary analysis was an exploratory factor analysis where we interpreted loadings greater than 0.4 as a satisfactory loading. Okay, so what did we find? First, regarding research question number 1, reliability, you see here on the right-hand column of this table, generally our measures were reliable. They were above our threshold. However, there are a couple of exceptions, which I will explain. First, we obtained low reliability for the ASRT. However, looking into this a little further, we discovered that the pattern and random items by themselves were highly reliable, 0.96 and 0.99. So that, coupled with the fact that this was our only measure from the ASRT, led us to keep this measure in for subsequent analyses. The other measure that fell below threshold was TOL imp block. Because we had another measure from the Tower of London that was above our threshold, we excluded imp block and just use imp normed in subsequent analyses. So from here on out, TOL will refer to this imp normed measure. But other than that, our tasks were all above the threshold. So there's a lot more information in this table, but I just want to quickly note one important finding, which is that the tasks that we used in our final analysis, none of them failed to show a significant learning effect. So here we see reliable learning effects as measured by the 95% confidence interval for these tasks in our final analysis. So we are seeing learning at the group level. For research questions 2 and 3, our initial evidence came from a correlation matrix. So in the top left-hand corner of this table, we see the intercorrelations among the procedural memory tasks. And it's clear that these correlations are all non-significant and generally pretty low, or around 0. And so this is suggesting that our procedural memory assessments may not show convergent validity. For research question 3, we see the correlations with declarative memory in the upper right-hand corner of this table. And what's notable here is that generally the Tower of London and ASRT do not correlate positively with declarative memory. So here, Tower of London, we see non-significant correlations and one significant negative correlation, and ASRT, all negative correlations. So these tasks this is suggestive that these tasks may show discriminant validity. However, somewhat unexpectedly, the weather prediction task correlated positively with the declarative memory task. So this suggests that the WPT perhaps looks a bit more declarative. But for our final analysis, we conducted an exploratory factor analysis on this data set. So before doing the factor analysis, we conducted a couple of preliminary analyses to make sure that it was reasonable to do a factor analysis with this data set. So we looked at sampling adequacy with the Kaiser-Meyer-Olkin scores. One threshold that's recommended in the literature is to have a Kaiser-Meyer-Olkin score above 0.6. So overall, we were above that threshold. Almost all of our tasks were also above this threshold. ASRT was a little bit low. However, as including the ASRT was motivated from based on our literature review, we kept it in for the factor analysis. We also conducted a scree plot analysis to decide how many factors we should include in our factor analysis. We conducted several statistics on this scree plot, most of them suggesting that there were 2 factors present in our data set. So given that, we conducted the factor analysis with 2 factors, procedural, which we expected to be, or maps on to procedural and declarative memory. Okay, so what did we find for our primary analysis? I'll start by talking about factor 1. We see a few satisfactory loadings on factor 1, the first 2 being CVMT and DECLEARN. MLAT did not load at our satisfactory threshold, but it was trending in that direction. Unexpectedly, weather prediction task also loaded onto this factor, which I'll come back to in just a minute. But for the time being, we suggest that given the loadings of CVMT and DECLEARN onto factor 1, we're interpreting this factor as declarative memory, because these are declarative memory tasks. Looking at factor 2, we don't see very many satisfactory loadings. The only task to go above threshold was ASRT. So given this, we don't really see evidence for a broad procedural memory factor here. We just see one task loading at a satisfactory level. So we don't think that this is reflecting procedural memory at a broad level. And then lastly, coming back to this weather prediction task loading, this is suggesting that the weather prediction task is actually patterning more closely with our declarative memory task, and perhaps reflects declarative memory in this study. Okay, so I'm going to hand it back to Kara now, who will go through the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Josh. So first, we'd like to summarize our results in relation to research questions. So in regard to our question about reliability, we found that the Tower of London and the dual task weather prediction task did indeed show acceptable reliability, and this was consistent with previous findings. But here we're extending this finding of reliability to the specific measures used in second language research. The ASRT, the alternating serial reaction time task, on the other hand, did not show acceptable reliable. And this is inconsistent with previous findings. But we're basing it off of a different dependent measure here. And specifically, we were using a different score that had been used in second language research previously. And we believe this different score appears to be the source of the low reliability. In regard to convergent validity, we did not find any positive correlations or the emergence of a procedural memory learning ability factor. So these tasks of procedural memory do not seem to jointly capture a broad construct of procedural memory learning ability. Interestingly, this lack of convergent validity generally is consistent with findings about implicit learning tasks. For example, we will hear or have heard about some convergent results from Godfroid and Kim. At the same time, we don't want to interpret these results yet to say that these are not tasks of procedural memory. We still think there is some validity within each task, as each task seems to engage procedural memory to some extent, as evidenced by the previous literature that we mentioned. Okay, in regard to discriminant validity, the alternating serial reaction time task and the Tower of London showed discriminant validity with our task of procedural memory learning ability, but the dual task weather prediction did not. And this is inconsistent with previous research. Why may that be? Well, Fiordi et al. Suggests that procedural memory may always be engaged in this task, but that the relative reliance will depend, the relative reliance on procedural memory will depend on the task conditions. For example, if it's a single versus dual task, if it's speeded versus slow. And now we did use the dual version of this task, but perhaps our participants did not fully engage in the tone counting task. And if this were the case, their reliance may not have been pushed to procedural memory. Okay, so do we think these tasks can be used to assess procedural memory learning ability? Well, yes, with reservations, but no as a way to assess a broad construct of procedural memory learning ability. Out of all the tasks, the ASRT, the alternating serial reaction time task, may be the most valid process pure task of procedural memory learning ability, but second language researchers should consider using a more reliable dependent measure for this task. And we also wanted to briefly report that we conducted a follow-up study with a subset of these participants in the current study. So 33 participants came back and completed a serial reaction time task, which has been used a couple times in the procedural memory second language literature, and has also been used in the implicit aptitude literature as well. And this follow-up study provided some evidence that the serial reaction time task in and of itself was reliable, and that it correlated with the alternating serial reaction time task. So these seem to both be tapping potentially a similar construct. Okay. Now, tying our results back to implicit language aptitude, really the topic of this symposium, we have a couple observations. Because procedural memory is one type of implicit learning ability, we think our results have implications for assessing implicit language aptitude. And that is that the alternating serial reaction time task and the serial reaction time task may be valid for this purpose. To the extent that the implicit language aptitude literature uses tasks that are also independently validated as assessing procedural memory learning ability, the results from that literature, from the implicit language aptitude literature, will have implications for questions about the role of procedural memory in second language. So we believe that with careful consideration of both of these literatures and of both of the various tasks used in both of these literatures, they may prove to be mutually informative. So to conclude, overall, we found evidence that the alternating serial reaction time task and potentially variants such as a serial reaction time task appear most valid for measuring procedural memory learning ability, but that reliable measures should be considered for the alternating serial reaction time task. And we believe that these results should inform research on procedural memory in second language, but they might also have implications for discussions about implicit language aptitude. And we're very much looking forward to engaging in those discussions with you. So thank you very much. And you can refer to this paper. We'd be happy to share it with you if you're interested. And thank you to Shaofeng Li for organizing this colloquium. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. What a fine collection of papers. What excellent research. My name's Nick Ellis. I'm the discussant for this colloquium on implicit language aptitude. It's a pleasure to be with you. In preparing for this, I've been using the presenters' written papers rather than their PowerPoints. There's a lot to talk about. I'm going to go quite quickly. I hope that you're able to recap, because this is a recorded presentation, if I go too fast. I apologize for any errors of interpretation on my part. It is wonderful to be thinking about this. It's wonderful to be thinking about this colloquium on implicit language aptitude. Why? It's going to be thinking about the construct, the measures, and the evidence. Why is it timely to be thinking about this? We've been worried about implicit language learning in the field for 30 years or more. We've recognized that the vast majority of the knowledge that, allows us to be fluent in our language processing has been acquired on the task of processing language, has been acquired implicitly. 25 years ago, there was this collection on implicit and explicit language learning. About 5 years ago, there was this collection. The frequency paper that I did in 2002 was arguing that the psycholinguistic research in all of the different domains of language, phonology, lexis, morphosyntax, syntax, fluent language processing, in all of these domains, we're tuned by our language experience. So what this symposium is about is what is the nature of the implicit learning that allows us to do that learning from processing language. And these 5 papers are cutting edge research, which I think are very exciting in their implications. It's a really well conceived project. It's a convergence of psychometric, cognitive, and linguistic research, tremendous methodological sophistication, non-trivial sample sizes, key questions in second language acquisition, some consistent take-home messages. Despite the difficulties of doing this research, implicit learning is hard, aptitude is hard, aptitude treatment interactions are difficult to do. I'm going to take you through each of the papers in turn and pull out what I find to be the major implications. I'm not going to describe the methods in detail. You've already seen these methods. I want to pull out from each, find the common findings, and then spend 5 or 6 minutes at the end talking about what I see to be the implications. So the first paper, 131 ESL learners, looking at the contributions of implicit statistical learning on implicit second language knowledge. The first key point is that they managed to get reliable measures of implicit learning, so decent reliabilities. They were then interested in, for these 4 different tests of implicit learning, do they converge? Is there one implicit language learning ability? And if you look at their correlations, the answer is no, there isn't. There is a lack of convergent validity, all hovering around 0 here, a lack of convergent validity on these measures of implicit statistical learning aptitude. The next question was, do these implicit learning aptitudes predict language knowledge, either explicit language knowledge or particularly implicit language knowledge? And they had a wide variety of implicit knowledge tests. So do these 4 implicit aptitudes predict implicit knowledge? And on the whole, they do not. Again, we have a correlation matrix filled with zeros. The only association in the correlation matrix that I can see is between the alternating serial reaction time task and word monitoring as a speeded test of language recognition, but it's on its own, and it's difficult data. When they pooled the language knowledge tests and had two factors of language knowledge, an implicit and an explicit factor of language knowledge, the serial learning aptitude tests didn't do anything. The Tower of London didn't do anything. The only thing that was there, is an association between ASRT and this implicit factor. So, paper 2, looking at syntactic priming as a measure of implicit learning, and that's really clever. And they're looking at syntactic priming effects in the native language, so highly skilled language processing in these Chinese participants. Does syntactic priming predict any aspect of their English language learning? They had a variety of explicit aptitude tests. They had a variety of implicit aptitude tests, priming, sequence learning again, and Llama-D. They expected this factor structure. What did they get? 166 CFL learners, fantastic. Did they get convergence of the explicit tests? Yes, they did. Did they get convergence of the implicit tests? No, they didn't. They did indeed get a dissociation between two of the implicit tests and explicit aptitude, but Llama-D loaded on the explicit test, and these two measures here did not predict anything to do with English implicit language knowledge. The third research question was looking at this Llama-D test, which has been used in the past as an index of incidental learning. 60 participants, made the instructions more incidental, added reaction time and confidence ratings. What did they find? They found that Llama-D had low reliability. It just about squeezed in as acceptable if you just looked at the old items. When they looked at performance, then confidence ratings predicted reaction time and accuracy, suggesting that this was more an explicit test. The only correlation with performance of Llama-D and implicit language processing was with not RT, not with accuracy, but the coefficient of variation predicted oral fluency, and it's just scraping in as significant. Paper 4, looking at implicit and explicitness in cognitive abilities and the interaction in predicting different types of feedback in learners. 112 learners, 3 groups, an implicit feedback group, an explicit feedback group, a control group, 2 well attested language aptitude batteries, looking to see if ability on these language aptitude tests predicts language acquisition. The aptitude tests had some of them low reliability. Were there correlations between implicit learning ability and picking up implicit feedback rather than explicit feedback? Yes. Were there associations between explicit learning ability and picking up implicit or explicit feedback? Explicit learning ability seems to have correlated more with explicit feedback. Interesting research. I'm interested in whether or not the uptake from recasts really was implicit. I think there needs to be more of a treatment check of what's going on in the implicit and explicit feedbacks. And there's an awful number of statistical analyses here with not a huge amount of power, but really interesting, really hard work. Finally, the final paper, 119 people looking at the reliability and convergent and discriminant validity of three different procedural memory tasks and 3 different declarative memory tasks. Is there a coherent implicit memory aptitude or procedural memory aptitude? Same old story, lack of convergent validity between the 3 measures. There is not a unitary implicit statistical learning aptitude. And is the patterning of the 4 tests similar? Well, no, 3 of the tests go together. And the weather prediction test loads much more on the explicit tests. So fantastic research. What's the take-home message from them all? Well, the positive take-home message, I think, is it's difficult to get reliable measures of implicit learning, but with care it can be done. The different implicit measures do not show convergence. Explicit measures do tend to load on one factor that is separate from implicit language knowledge. Does implicit aptitude generally predict implicit or explicit language knowledge? Yeah, not much. Maybe in paper 1, maybe in paper 4, but the findings are not terribly robust, I don't think. Negative half-empty considerations. Some of the studies are still underpowered, the effects are small. There are too many statistical steps, harkable choice points in the statistical analyses. It would be lovely to see which of these findings replicates. But this is such a good first step. Need for further conceptual clarity? Yeah, need for further conceptual clarity. The same task, serial reaction time, is sometimes called implicit learning, sometimes implicit aptitude, sometimes procedural learning. We are not alone in doing this sort of research. There's a lot of excitement. It's being done to see if there is implicit learning deficit in specific language impairment. There's a lot of excitement about first and second language learning ability, individual differences in those learnings. The work on an implicit learning aptitude shows that you can get reasonable retest stability over a week, but same findings, lack of convergence of these different tests. Do these different tests predict, are they separate from traditional IQ and working memory tests? Yes, they are. They don't predict those things at all. And same findings in the research as well on being clear about what these different tests measure. So serial reaction time is sometimes called sequence learning, sometimes statistical learning, sometimes visual statistical learning, sometimes implicit learning. We've got some work to do to find out what's going on here. And these different tests differ on so many different dimensions: modality, the nature of the material, the nature of the statistical dependencies. There's a lot of work still to be done. If there are various types of implicit learning aptitude, are they by modality? Probably. Are they by dependency type? Probably. Are they by whether or not the things that you're learning are symbolic or non-symbolic? Almost certainly. Are they dependent on domain of language? Yes, probably. Are they dependent on the saliency of the material to be learned? I believe so. I believe, for me, the most important thing here is the take-home message here is what's relevant is not statistical learning per se, it's statistical learning of things that are important to us. Learning is never content-free, but aptitude actually assumes it is. New knowledge always builds on old knowledge. Content trumps learning process. What you see in front of you here is some content. You have rich patterned knowledge of that content. There is exquisite statistical structure here, both local and longer distant. You know these patterns as a result of thousands of hours on task, but you just can't see it at the moment in this form. But in this form, the same thing. You might start to see some better patterns, some more recognizable patterns. And in this form, well, you can see it absolutely fine. The point is that statistical learning is over things that we have already experienced, things that are important, language representations. Here are two problem spaces, an English problem space and a French problem space. What we're doing as we read these papers is deep learning of these materials. Implicit learning, deep learning, convoluted neural networks can now do face recognition, as we very well know from the media. And what's happening is over multiple convoluted layers, it's picking up, these models are picking up local features and then combinations of these features and eventually face features. Does that work for language? Yes, it does. Here is a deep learning system which matches human professionals in the translation of English into Czech. So I think that as we're looking at these problem spaces, what we're doing is building more and more sophisticated representations of the connections between things that we already know about. I think of this as learning features of the input. Other people think about this as procedural learning. Let me give you one final English problem space. Here it is. We land in London. We want to find out more about London. We go on a trip. We go on another trip. We go on another run. 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 And eventually, over time, we develop this rich procedural knowledge of London. But what have we learned here? We've learned the relations between the key features of London. Think of a French problem space and landing in Rue Suget and doing the same thing there. And over time, all of this processing of language gives us a rich map of the key features of Paris. But what we have here are not go left and go right. What we have are the procedures which connect the important features of London or of France, of Paris. This is what I think implicit learning is about. Implicit learning is never content free. The content is critically important. Thank you for letting me think about this.